She had $10 and a piece of paper no one wanted. The wind off the Maine coast didn't care about either. It hit her full in the face at the top of the cliff, cold, salt, indifferent, and somewhere below, the Atlantic was doing what it always did, making its noise, keeping its own time. She looked down at the ruin. 4 walls. A roof that had given up long ago. Hers. Her brother had laughed when he signed it over. The man who owned it had shrugged like a man setting down something heavy he was glad to be rid of. They were both certain they had gotten the better of her. They had no idea what was sealed inside that tower. Neither did she, not yet. She picked up her trunk and walked toward the gate. Claire Hartwell had $10 and a deed to a pile of rocks. That was it. That was everything. The $10 were folded inside her left glove, pressed flat against her palm, where she could feel them with every step. The deed was in her coat pocket, folded 3 times, edges soft from how many times she'd unfolded it and folded it back. She'd read it so many times she could recite it from memory. Ravenstone Keep, Hartwell Cove, Maine. Property of record transferred to Miss Claire Hartwell, in full settlement of outstanding obligation. Outstanding obligation. Like she was a bill someone finally got around to paying. She stood at the top of the cliff path and looked down at it. The Atlantic was gray that morning. Not the pretty gray of watercolor paintings. The real gray. Heavy and cold and indifferent. The kind of gray that had been there long before anyone put a name to this coastline and would be there long after. The wind came off the water in long flat sheets. The kind that didn't gust so much as press. It pressed against her coat. Against her face. Against the single trunk she'd carried up from the village road because there was no one to carry it for her. And there, at the edge of the headland, sat Ravenstone Keep. She had tried to prepare herself. She had told herself on the train from Portland that it would be bad. She had told herself again on the wagon road from town, watching the spruce trees thin out and the granite ledge begin to push up through the soil like old bones refusing to stay buried. She had told herself a 3rd time when Hartwell Cove came into view below the hill, a fist of gray stone buildings huddled against the water, smoke from chimneys bending sideways in the wind. She had not prepared herself enough. Ravenstone Keep was not a ruin in the romantic sense. It was not ivy-covered walls and photogenic archways. It was a skeleton. The main hall had no roof. 2 of its walls still stood to their full height. The other 2 had collapsed inward and lay in a heap of granite blocks so moss-covered they looked like they'd been growing there since the beginning of time. The kitchen wing was marginally better, the walls intact, a section of roof still covering the eastern end, but every window was a dark open socket, every door long gone. And then there was the tower. The sea tower stood at the very edge of the headland, where the cliff dropped away to the water, round, dark, built from a different stone than the rest of the keep. Black granite shot through with something that caught what little light there was and threw it back in flickers. It rose 4 stories above the cliff top, and despite everything, despite the collapsed hall and the roofless walls and the general overwhelming evidence of catastrophic neglect, the tower looked solid. It looked like it had been built to outlast everything around it. It probably had. Claire stood there for a long time. The wind pushed at her. The Atlantic made its noise below. A cormorant flew past at eye level, heading south, and didn't spare her a glance. She picked up her trunk and walked toward the gate. The person who had taught her to look at a building that way was not her father. Her father, William Hartwell, had been a gentleman, a good man. The kind of man who read history books at the dinner table and apologized to the books when he closed them mid-chapter, as if the story minded being interrupted. He had loved Hartwell Farm the way he loved everything, quietly, completely, without much practical attention to whether it was falling apart around him. He had known the name of every bird that nested in the south field. He had not known the name of the man who fixed the cellar drainage, though he had paid him 4 times. Her brother Richard had inherited none of that gentleness. Richard had inherited the practical mind without the warmth. He saw numbers first, people second, obligations not at all, unless they were the kind that could be enforced in court. By the time Claire was 12, she understood that Richard looked at her and saw a line item, a cost, something that would eventually need to be resolved. Their mother had died when Claire was 6. She had very little memory of her beyond a particular smell, lavender and cedar, the smell of the linen chest in the upstairs hall. That was all. A smell and a closed door. What she had instead of a mother was Mrs. Edna Morse. Mrs. Morse had been the housekeeper at Hartwell Farm for as long as Claire could remember. She was 65 years old when Claire's father died, and she had been doing the same things the same way for 30 of those years. Short woman, iron gray hair, hands that were always doing something, folding, mending, kneading, measuring. She did not believe in idle hands. She did not believe in much that couldn't be proven useful. She had started teaching Claire when Claire was 8 years old. Not embroidery, not watercolors, not the kind of accomplishments that were supposed to make a young woman marriageable and agreeable. Mrs. Morse had no patience for accomplishments. She taught Claire things that worked, how to test a beam for dry rot by pressing a penknife into the wood. If it sank in more than a quarter inch, the wood was compromised. How to read the waterline on a stone foundation, the dark band that told you how high the groundwater rose in spring. How to mix lime and sand in the right proportions for pointing mortar, and why getting the ratio wrong meant the whole repair would fail inside 2 winters. She taught her how to keep accounts, not just add the columns up but read them, see where money was bleeding away, identify the expenses that were necessary and the ones that were habit, distinguish between a repair that was urgent and one that could wait, and know the difference between waiting and ignoring. A house has bones, Mrs. Morse had told her once, standing in the cellar of Hartwell Farm with a lantern in one hand and Claire's hand in the other, showing her where the foundation stones had begun to shift on the north wall. It breathes and it settles. Learn its bones, and it will keep you warm when everything else goes cold. Claire had been 11 years old. She had not entirely understood it then. She thought she was beginning to understand it now. Her father died in March, quickly. A fever that swept through the county that winter took him in 8 days. He was there and then he wasn't, and the gap he left was shapeless and enormous, and nothing like what she'd expected grief to feel like. She had expected it to be like losing something. It felt more like the floor shifting, like the angle of everything changed by 2 degrees, not enough to fall, but enough that nothing felt level anymore. Richard moved fast. He was at Hartwell Farm within 2 days of the funeral. His wife, a thin-lipped woman named Harriet, who had visited the farm exactly 4 times in 5 years of marriage, came with him. By the end of the first week, Harriet was measuring windows. By the end of the second, Claire found a crate in the upstairs hall, with her name written on it in Richard's handwriting. It held her mother's linen chest, both her winter coats, a hat box, 3 books from the library that Richard had apparently decided she was sentimentally attached to, though he'd chosen wrong on all 3. The meeting with Prescott Sims was in Portland. Sims had been the Hartwell family lawyer for 20 years. He was 60 years old, thin, precise, and visibly unhappy about this particular morning's business. He had the kind of face that carried its distress in very small signals, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible pull at the corner of his mouth. Claire had known him since she was a girl. She could read him. He was very unhappy. The office smelled of old paper and cedar oil. There was a clock on the mantel that ticked too loudly. Sims sat behind his desk and arranged documents she hadn't asked to see, which meant he was stalling, which meant what he was about to say was worse than she was prepared for. Richard was not present. Of course he wasn't. He had sent Sims to handle it the way you send someone to handle a delivery. You didn't show up in person for something like this. It wasn't personal. That was the point. Sims read the terms in a flat, careful voice. $500, full and final settlement, in exchange for any and all future claim on the Hartwell name and estate. Removal, a position from the county preferred as governess or companion could be arranged through a family connection if she required assistance. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the number written on the paper and felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't rage exactly. It was colder than rage. It was the sensation of being shown, very clearly, what someone thought you were worth. Not in anger, not with cruelty, just with arithmetic. This is the humber. Take it and go. No, she said. Sims looked up. Miss Hartwell. No, she said it again, just as quietly. Not louder, not harder. Just again. I won't take it. The clock ticked. Sims set down his papers. He was quiet for a moment. That particular quality of quiet that meant he was deciding whether to say something he wasn't supposed to say. She recognized it. She'd seen it in him before, at her father's funeral, when he'd stood too long at the graveside after everyone else had walked away. He opened a different drawer. He took out a single document, smaller than the others. He set it on the desk between them and looked at it the way people look at something they're not sure is a kindness or a cruelty. "There is another matter," he said. "A property. Ravenstone Keep, Harwick Cove. Your father held a note of obligation from Harlan Ashford, a land dispute settled out of court 8 years ago. Ashford has offered to forgive the obligation in full and transfer the property deed instead." He paused. "I must be honest with you, Miss Hartwell. The property has been uninhabited since 1893. Before that, it was occupied by a single elderly woman who had no legal claim to it. It is considered by every assessment a liability. The structure is largely in collapse. Ashford's people have been trying to divest it for years." He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "It is a ruin. A pile of stones on a cliff. He is, in effect, using it to close a debt he would rather not pay in cash. A pile of stones on a cliff." She thought about the $500 on the edge of the desk. She thought about what it would buy. A year, maybe 2, in a rented room somewhere. A position in some other family's household where she would be neither family nor staff, neither here nor there, useful and invisible and slowly made into the shape of whatever was needed. She thought about what Mrs. Morse had told her. "Learn its bones." "I'll take the deed," she said. Sims looked at her for a long moment. He did not argue. He pushed the document across the desk, indicated where she should sign, and handed her his pen. She signed her name in her usual handwriting, which was small and clear and did not shake. He blotted the signature. He folded the deed. He slid it into an envelope and held it out. And then, as she was rising from her chair, as she was reaching for her coat, already thinking about the train north, he said something. Low, almost to himself. The way people say things they've been keeping too long and can't hold anymore. "Your father went to Ravenstone. September of 1889. He traveled up there himself, without telling me why. I only know because he mentioned it afterward, in passing, the way he mentioned things he didn't want to explain." He paused. "I don't know what he found there, but he came back different. And 2 years later he added a codicil to his will that I was instructed not to discuss unless it became relevant." He met her eyes. "I thought perhaps you should know he had been there." She stood in the doorway of the office and looked at him. She wanted to ask. She had about 14 questions. She could feel them backing up behind her teeth. But something in his expression told her this was all he was going to say. Not because he didn't know more, because he was waiting to see what she did first. She nodded once. Walked out. She carried the deed in her pocket all the way to the train station. She pressed her hand against it once, through the wool of her coat. Felt the folded edge. A pile of stones on a cliff. Hers. The train journey north took 6 hours. She watched Maine go past the window, the farms giving way to forest, the forest giving way to ledge, the ledge to sea. The air changed as they went north, the way air does near the coast, gaining weight and salt and a particular sharpness that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the ocean's presence just out of sight. She arrived in the nearest town by late afternoon. She hired a wagon to Harwick Cove, and the driver, a man of few words and no curiosity whatsoever, deposited her trunk at the top of the village road and took her money and left, which was how she came to be standing in the middle of Harwick Cove's single main street, in the early October wind, with her trunk at her feet, staring at a cluster of grey stone buildings that stared back with the blank, weathered indifference of a place that had seen worse than her and expected to see worse again. The village was small, maybe 40 buildings, the kind of place that exists because the sea exists, because fishing exists, because someone a long time ago decided this particular cove offered enough shelter to be worth the difficulty of everything else. There was a general store, a post office that appeared to also be someone's parlor, a chandlery that smelled of tar and rope halfway down the street, a low stone building near the waterfront with no sign that was almost certainly a tavern. The people of Harwick Cove looked at her. They were not rude about it. They were simply direct. A woman in an apron outside the general store looked her over with calm, complete attention. The way you assess something you're not sure what to make of yet. Two men mending a lobster trap by the road's edge watched her pass without interrupting their work. A man sitting on a crate outside the chandlery, very old, a piece of emery cloth in his hand and a chisel across his knees, looked up as she came near and held the look. This was the man she stopped beside. She wasn't sure why. Something in the stillness of him. Something in the way he was working the particular focused patience of a person who understood their materials. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Ravenstone Keep." The old man looked at her trunk, looked at her face, looked up the hill toward the headland, then back at her. Up the track. His voice was a low Maine coastal voice. The vowels flattened, the consonants economical. "Can't miss it. Only thing up there." He paused. "You going to stay?" "Yes." He said nothing to that. Just looked at her for another moment with those clear, pale eyes, blue, going gray with age, the color of the water on overcast days. Then he went back to his chisel. "I'm Claire Hartwell," she said. She didn't know why she said it. She was not normally someone who explained herself to strangers. But something about this particular morning, this particular moment, made her want her name to be said out loud. For it to land somewhere. The old man's hand slowed. He set down the chisel. He looked at her again, and this time the look was different. Not curiosity. Something older than curiosity. Something that sat in his face the way old scars sit present, quiet, no longer hurting. "Hartwell," he repeated. "Yes, Claire Hartwell. William Hartwell was my father." The old man was very still. Then he said, "I know that name." He said it the way people say things they've been holding for a long time. Not startled, not relieved. Just releasing it. A fact that had been sitting in him, waiting for the right moment to become a thing he could say. She stared at him. He looked back at her. The wind came off the water. Her trunk sat on the road beside her. The whole village was going about its business around them. Nets and ropes and the smell of fish and wood smoke, and in the middle of all of it she was standing next to a man she had never met, who knew her dead father's name and was looking at her like he had been expecting her. "My name is Silas Vane," he said. He didn't say anything else. Not yet, just, that was his name. As if names were enough for now and the rest could wait. She nodded, picked up the handle of her trunk, started up the track toward the headland. She did not know, standing there on that road, with the wind in her coat and the deed in her pocket, that Silas Vane was 68 years old, that he had been a man in his early 40s in 1866, already 20 years into his trade, already the kind of mason people trusted with work that needed to last, that he had once done a very specific job for a woman named Eleanor Reed, that he had kept the secret of that job for 28 years, not because he was told to keep it, but because no one who had come to Ravenstone since had seemed like the right person to tell. She did not know any of that yet. She just walked. The track up to the headland was steep and wrong in the way coastal paths are wrong, designed by erosion and use, not intention. It switchbacked twice, through gorse and dead heather, and then climbed straight up a shelf of exposed granite, where there was nothing between her and the Atlantic wind at all. Her trunk weighed 40 pounds. By the time she reached the top, her arms had stopped complaining and moved on to a kind of numb, functional acceptance. She set it down at the edge of what had once been the gatehouse. 2 stone stumps, waist-high, where the gateposts had stood. Between them, a gap in the curtain wall just wide enough for a cart, maybe. The curtain wall itself still stood on 3 sides of the property, 4 feet thick at the base, listing slightly in places, but fundamentally intact. The sea had not taken it, neither had time. The wall at least had done its job. She walked through the gap. The courtyard inside was not a courtyard anymore. Exactly. It was an ecosystem. 40 years of leaves and blown-in soil had built up over the paving stones. Coastal weeds had moved in sea pinks, hardy grasses, something low and dense that smelled faintly medicinal when she stepped on it. 2 generations of birds had nested in the high corners of the standing walls. She could hear them even now, the distant sound of wings on stone somewhere above. She stood in the middle of it and made herself look. She did this systematically, the way Mrs. Morse had taught her. You don't look at a problem all at once. You break it into pieces. You assess what you can change and what you can't. You do not spend energy mourning the things that are already gone. The main hall, unroofed, 2 walls down. The fallen stone was still there that was salvageable. The timber, exposed to 40 years of Maine winters, was not. The hall itself could not be rebuilt in any near time frame, but the fallen stone could be reused and the site could be cleared. The kitchen wing, walls intact, eastern section partially roofed. The roof was a section of heavy overlapping stone slabs, old construction, pre-timber, built to last. The timber structure beneath it had rotted in places, but if she could stabilize what remained and replace the worst sections, it could be made waterproof. That was the priority. Waterproof and weather-tight. Everything else came after. The tower, she turned to face it. The sea tower rose at the far end of the courtyard, built right against the south wall of the keep where the cliff dropped away. Black granite. 4 stories. The external staircase that had once connected it to the rest of the structure was long gone, the corbels that had supported it still protruding from the wall like broken teeth. At the base of the tower, where the entrance should have been, was a solid flat face of stone. No door, no opening, just wall. She walked toward it. The tower wall was cold under her hand. The stones were massive. She couldn't have encircled one, with both arms fitted with that particular precision that spoke of a builder who took it personally. The gaps between them were tight, dry. The mortar in those gaps was grayish-white, not crumbled, not pitted. She stopped. She pressed her palm flat against the fill at the base of the tower. She leaned in and looked more closely. The mortar around the tower stones was different from the mortar on the curtain wall. The curtain wall mortar was lime-based, old, gone soft and powdery in places, dark with age. This mortar was not dark. It was not powdery. It was dense and smooth, and it had not taken on the same weathering as everything around it. She pulled her glove off and touched it with her bare hand. The mortar on the curtain wall was rough, almost crumbling. The mortar here was firm, still slightly crystalline. She straightened up, stood back, looked at the solid face of the tower base, no door, no window, no opening of any kind, and understood what she was seeing. This had not collapsed. There was no rubble. There was no void, no depression in the ground where a wall had fallen. The base of the tower was simply filled, solid, as if someone had gone through the door and then built a wall behind them on the way out, or built it from the outside. Because the mortar on this section of wall was not 40 years old, she would have bet her remaining money on that. The mortar on this section was 25 years old, 30 at the most. Someone had sealed this tower, deliberately, within living memory. She stood in the cold October wind on the headland above Hartwell Cove and looked at a wall that should not have existed, and thought about Silas Vane. I know that name. She had said her father's name, and the old man on the crate had gone still. She was going to need to have a longer conversation with Silas Vane. But first she needed shelter, the kitchen wing. She turned away from the tower and went to work. The eastern section of the kitchen wing, the part still under the old stone roof, was one room, roughly 15 feet by 20. The floor was packed earth, hard and dry despite everything. The fireplace was enormous, the kind built to cook for 20 people, and it was plugged with 40 years of bird nests and collapsed chimney debris. The windows were open stone sockets, no glass, no shutters, and they faced north and east, which was exactly wrong for the Maine coast in October, which meant they would need to be addressed immediately if she intended to stay. She did intend to stay. She spent what remained of that first afternoon doing 3 things. First, she cleared enough debris from the room to have a floor she could walk on. Not all of it, just the worst of it, the collapsed sections of interior wall, the fallen shelving timber, the drifted leaves, and the top layer of accumulated everything. She stacked it outside the door, sorted by type. Stone in one pile, wood in another. The wood she would assess for soundness later. The stone she would use. Second, she used a length of salvaged lath to sound the chimney. She pushed it up from the firebox until it stopped, then worked it sideways, cleared a channel. Not all the way to the top, just enough to let the worst of the blockage fall through. There was still too much debris up there for a fire to draw safely, but she could see through to a patch of gray sky by the time she was done. Third, she boarded the north window. She had found 3 lengths of shelving timber in the debris pile, dry at the center though wet at the ends. She cut them to length against the window opening with the small folding saw she'd packed Mrs. Morse had insisted on the saw and nailed them across the inside of the opening with cut nails she'd salvaged from a collapsed interior partition. It was not a window, it was a stop, but it blocked the worst of the wind. By the time she finished, the light was going. She ate the food she'd bought in the village. Bread, hard cheese, a tin of sardines, a small bag of dried apples. She sat on her trunk in the corner of the room with her coat still on, and her hat still on, and a single candle lit on the stone beside her, and she listened to the Atlantic. From up here on the headland, the sound was not a crashing. It was a presence, low and continuous and enormous, the sound of something that had no beginning or end, that had been making that sound since before there were people on these cliffs to hear it. It moved through the stone of the walls the way cold moved through stone, everywhere at once, in all directions. She was afraid. She noticed it the way you notice something that isn't useful, something you put to one side because there's nothing to be done about it right now. She was cold and tired and sitting in a roofless ruin in the dark with $10 in her glove, and she was afraid. Perfectly ordinary. Reasonable even. Fear was just information. Mrs. Morse had said that too. Fear is your body telling you something needs doing. Listen to what it's pointing at, then do that thing. What it was pointing at was the tower. She lay down on her coat spread over a length of canvas she'd tacked to the floor to keep the damp out and looked up at the sagging ceiling, and she thought about the mortar. 25 years. Someone had built that wall at the base of the tower sometime between 1865 and 1870. Someone who knew what they were doing. The mortar mix was right. The stones were properly keyed. Not amateur work. Skilled work. Careful work. Someone who understood masonry and did not want that entrance opened again. Why? And how did her father fit? He had come to Ravenstone in September of 1889. Alone. He had not explained it. He had come back different. According to Sims, in the unspecific way that people come back different from things that change how they see something important. 2 years later, he had added something to his will. She pressed her hand over the deed in her coat pocket. Ravenstone Keep. He had known about this place. He had come here, and then he had made sure she could come here too. She did not know why yet, but she was going to find out. The candle burned down. The Atlantic breathed below the cliff. The wind found the gap between the north boards and pressed through in a thin, steady draft that she pulled her coat tighter against. She slept. In the morning she went back down to the village. Silas Vane was not outside the chandlery. She found him at the waterfront, sitting on an overturned dory, watching 2 younger men haul a net. He had a mug of something in his hand. He watched her come down the road and he did not look surprised. She sat down on a bollard across from him. Ravenstone. No preamble. Ravenstone, he agreed. The tower entrance has been filled in. She watched his face. With mortar. Deliberate. Fairly recently, his eyes stayed on the net. The stone roof over the kitchen wing is still sound, she said. The timbers rotted out in places, but the corbels are intact. I think it can be stabilized. He said nothing. I need a mason, she said. Specifically, I need someone who knows the difference between what can be repaired and what needs to come down. He finally looked at her. You going to ask me about your father, he said. It was not a question. Not yet, she said. First, I need to know if you can look at that tower and tell me what I'm dealing with. He looked at her for a long moment. The same look he'd given her yesterday reading something. Taking his time about it, he drained the mug. Tomorrow, he said. Early. She stood up, smoothed her coat. What was the name of the woman who lived there, she asked. She kept her voice even, before. The elderly woman. A pause. Eleanor Reed, he said. He said the name like it cost him something small. And she noticed. She stored it away next to everything else she was storing: the mortar, her father's name, the sealed tower, the deed in her pocket, and she walked back up the road toward Ravenstone. There was too much she didn't know yet. But she was beginning to understand the shape of what she didn't know, and that Mrs. Morse had told her once, standing in a dark cellar with a lantern and a lesson, was always the first step. You have to learn the bones before you can start. Silas Vane arrived at Ravenstone at 7 in the morning. No knock, no announcement. Claire heard his boots on the courtyard stone and was already up, already dressed, already holding a mug of water heated over the small fire she'd managed in the kitchen hearth. The chimney still drew badly. The room smelled of smoke. She didn't care. He walked in, looked at what she'd done to the room in one night, and said nothing. She was beginning to understand how Silas Vane expressed approval. He set his canvas bag down by the door, pulled out a small hammer and a cold chisel, looked at her. "Tower first," he said. They walked across the courtyard together in the early light. The Atlantic was silver that morning, the kind of flat calm that came after wind, the sea resting between efforts. Gulls called somewhere below the cliff. The tower rose ahead of them, black and patient, the same as it had been yesterday, and the day before, and for the last 150 years. Silas went straight to the filled-in entrance. He did not touch it right away. He stood back and looked at it the way Claire had looked at it, reading it. Then he stepped forward and put his hand flat against the mortar, pressed, tapped with one knuckle in 3 different places. He turned to her. 1866, he said. She stared at him. "That's when this was done," he said. He said it to the wall, not to her. The aggregate in this mix, that's how they were doing it in the 60s. After that they changed the formula. He tapped again. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. "Can you open it?" "Takes 2 days. He crouched down and examined the base course. "Maybe 3. Whoever built this keyed the stones in properly. You can't just pry. You have to work from the edges in." "All right." He looked up at her. "You're not going to ask me how I know it was 1866. It was not a question. It was an observation." He said it with the same flat tone he used for everything, but underneath it was something else, something careful. "Not yet," she said. He nodded once, reached into his bag for a longer pry bar. She went back to the kitchen wing and started on the chimney. The days that followed had a shape to them. Not the shape she'd expected chaos, one crisis after another, the endless improvisation of someone making it up as she went. Instead there was a rhythm. Early light. A fire in the kitchen if she could get it going. Silas at the tower. Claire wherever the most urgent thing was. By the end of the first week, 2 more men from the village had appeared. Silas had sent them without asking her first, which she found she didn't mind. Owen Pell, a carpenter, 40 years old, quiet and methodical. Ray Cutler, a general laborer, younger, fast, good at moving stone. She paid them in cash, fair wages on Friday afternoons. No negotiation, no IOU. She counted the coins into their hands the ways Mrs. Morse had counted wages at Hartwell Farm, directly and without apology, because wages were not a favor, and treating them like one was disrespectful. Owen Pell noticed. She could tell by the way he said thank you, not the automatic thank you of someone being polite, but the specific thank you of someone who had been underpaid before and recognized the difference. She didn't comment on it. She just handed Ray Cutler his wages next. The tower took Silas 4 days, not 3. On the morning of the 5th day, he came to find her in the kitchen wing, where she was helping Owen assess the timber situation in the roof structure. Silas stood in the doorway. His face was the same as always, weathered, still economical. But his eyes were doing something different. "It's open," he said. She followed him. The filled section of the tower base was gone. The stones Silas had removed were stacked neatly to one side. In the courtyard he had saved them all, which told her something about how he thought. The opening was low and narrow, roughly rectangular, about 4 feet high and 2 feet wide. The original doorway would have been taller. Whoever sealed it had not gone all the way to the lintel, just high enough. She ducked through. The ground floor of the tower was a single circular room, maybe 20 feet across. Stone floor, cold. The air inside was still not damp still, not stale still. Remarkably dry, actually. The tower walls were 4 feet thick and had kept the interior temperature so stable that very little moisture had gotten in. There was no debris, no fallen stone, no accumulated leaves. And in the center of the room, a fireplace big enough to stand in. She stood in it, looked up. The flue was clear. She could see a circle of Maine sky, pale blue at the top. And then she looked at the back wall of the fireplace. She almost missed it. The soot was thick and uniform, and the back wall looked exactly like the other walls, massive stone blocks, tight mortar, solid. But there was one block, lower left, slightly different in color. The soot pattern around it was wrong. Too even. Like it had been cleaned and resuited deliberately, or like it had been set in place after everything else was already coated. She pressed her palm against it. She heard it. Not a sound, exactly. A sensation. The particular absence of resonance that means something is hollow behind. She turned around. Silas was standing in the doorway watching her. "Did you know?" she said. A pause. "I knew there was a room," he said. "I didn't know if anything was still in it." She looked at him. "You sealed this tower, not a question, not an accusation. Just the fact, laid flat." He came inside, sat down on a stone near the doorway. His hands rested on his knees, still for once. "Eleanor Reed hired me," he said. "Winter of 1866, in my early 40s. She paid me 3 months' wages for 4 days' work and told me to tell no one. And you didn't. And I didn't." The circle of sky above the fireplace was the same pale blue it had been. Nothing changed about the room. But everything in Claire had shifted slightly, the way ground shifts before an earthquake. Not the earthquake itself. The before. "The block," she said, "in the back of the fireplace." He nodded. She went back to the kitchen wing, came back with the iron pry bar she'd been using on roof timbers, looked at the block, measured the gap with her eye. Then she started working. It took most of that day. The block was not a door, it was just a block. Heavy and precisely fitted, mortared on 3 sides and sitting on a ledge of stone at the base. The mortar had to be chipped away carefully. Not broken. Chipped. Because the blocks around it were load-bearing, and she was not going to bring down part of the tower trying to get through a wall. She worked with the cold chisel and the small hammer, then the pry bar, then back to the chisel. Her arms ached by noon. By mid-afternoon, her hands had stopped feeling the cold. Owen and Ray brought her food without being asked. Bread and salt cod, wrapped in cloth. She ate standing up, looking at her progress. Silas did not help with the opening. He sat nearby, and was present in the way that old people with difficult histories are present, not interfering, not leaving, just bearing witness. The block shifted at 4 o'clock. She levered it out. It was heavy, 2 people heavy, and she had to work it in stages, tipping it forward and catching it against her forearms before it could fall. It came down with a deep, resonant thud on the stone floor. The sound rang around the circular room and then faded. She picked up the lantern, ducked through. The hidden room was small, 10 feet by 8 maybe. The ceiling was low, she could have touched it with her hand flat. The floor was swept stone, clean even now. The same remarkable dry stillness as the tower itself. In the center of the room, a wooden chest, rectangular, dark with age, iron-bound at all 4 corners, the iron gone to a deep reddish brown. No lock. She could see the hasp, the loop was through the ring, but nothing held it, just resting. She knelt in front of it. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this and found it almost funny, in a distant sort of way. She had carried 40-pound stones. She had chipped mortar for 8 hours. Her hands had not shaken once during any of that, and now they were shaking because of a wooden box. She lifted the hasp. She opened the lid. Canvas bags. 4 of them, each tied with cord, each heavy with the particular dense weight of coin. She opened one gold. Federal gold double eagles, the kind that had been minted in the 1840s and 50s, the kind her father's generation had called real money. There were smaller bags nested alongside them, silver coinage, and tucked at the side of the chest, a small leather pouch that clinked softly when she lifted it. She opened the pouch. Pearls. Not perfectly round, not matched, not the kind that came in velvet boxes from jewelers in Boston. The irregular kind, the real kind. Milky and soft in the lantern light, each one slightly different. The kind that a sea captain's wife might have accumulated over years from various ports, various gifts, various small moments of ordinary life that had somehow survived everything else. She set the pouch down. She lifted the final thing from the chest. A tin box, flat, the kind used for documents. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, a journal. Small, the cover worn smooth at the corners. She opened it to the first page and read the name written there, in small, careful script. Eleanor A. Reed, Harwick Cove, Maine. Begun October 12, 1848. She sat back on her heels, 45 years. The woman had kept this journal from 1848 until her death in 1893. Claire could see the dates change as she carefully fanned the pages, the handwriting shifting from a younger, more regular hand to something that got larger and less even as the years went on. More space between the words. The particular expansion of handwriting in old age, when fine motor control begins to go. She carried the journal to the lantern and started reading. Eleanor Reed had been 30 years old when she started the journal. Her husband, James Reed, was a coastal shipping captain who ran cargo from Portland to the maritime ports up and down the New England coast. They had come to Ravenstone Keep in 1846. When James was offered the position of property caretaker by Harlan Ashford's father, who owned the land but had no interest in living on it. The arrangement suited them a home, a small stipend, and James could still take his ship out on regular runs. In 1848, James Reed's ship went down in a storm off the Maine coast. They found wreckage. They never found James. Eleanor stayed. That was what the journal said in those flat, affactual early entries. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because she had no family willing to take her in. She stayed because the keep, broken as it was the only place that felt like hers. She had rebuilt the kitchen wing by herself, with help from a few men in the village, over the first 2 years. She had made a garden. She had maintained the lighthouse record. Ravenstone was not an official lighthouse, but Eleanor kept a lamp burning in the tower window on storm nights, because the harbor mouth was dangerous, and she had watched enough fishermen's wives pace the docks to know what the light meant. She had kept the tower lamp burning for 45 years. Claire read for a long time. The room around her got darker. She did not notice. She was in 1855, then 1862, then the hard winter of 1871 when the bay froze, and Eleanor had run out of firewood by February and survived on what she could burn from the fallen timbers in the main hall. She was in 1879 when the Ashford estate sent an agent to assess the property, and Eleanor had met him at the gate and sent him away because the keep was her home and she had no intention of leaving, and the agent, to his credit, had written in his report that the property was occupied by a permanent resident of sound mind who had made significant improvements at her own expense and eviction was not recommended. She was in September 1889 when she found what she was looking for. The entry was longer than most, wider margins. The handwriting careful in a way the later entries usually weren't, as if Eleanor had written it more than once before she wrote it here. September 14, 1889. A man came to the gate this morning. William Hartwell, from Portland. He said he had read about Ravenstone in the county land records and had an interest in its history. He was perhaps 50 years old. Quiet manner, the kind of quiet that comes from paying attention rather than having nothing to say. I let him in. I made coffee. We sat in the kitchen and I told him about James, about the years after, about the tower lamp and the garden and the way this place had settled into me or I into it. I was no longer sure which. He listened the way some people listen, as if what you are saying is the most important thing happening in the world at that moment. He asked if I was afraid, living here alone. I told him I had been, in the beginning. Then, I learned the bones of the place, and it stopped feeling like something I was enduring, and started feeling like something I was part of. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, I have a daughter. She is 19 years old. She is the most capable person I know, and no one around her seems to understand that yet, including her. If there comes a time when she needs a place to stand, I would like her to have one that is worthy of her. I did not know what to say to that. He left in the afternoon. He shook my hand at the gate, both hands, the way people shake hands when they mean something by it. I think about what he said. I have thought about it every day since. I am 70 years old. I am not well. I do not expect to be here another 10 years. I hope his daughter comes. I hope she is the kind of person who understands bones. Claire sat in the small hidden room under the tower of Ravenstone Keep, in the dark, with the lantern guttering low beside her, and held the journal in her lap and did not move for a long time. Her father had been here. He had sat in Eleanor Reed's kitchen and drunk her coffee, and talked about Claire without knowing he was doing it, without knowing he was describing someone Eleanor would recognize, someone Eleanor had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. 2 years after that visit, he had added a codicil to his will. 4 years after that visit, he was gone. And 3 weeks after he was gone, Claire had been sitting in Prescott Sims's office, looking at $500 on a mahogany desk, and she had pushed it away, and she had taken the deed instead, and she had not known why exactly, not known it consciously, not named it, but she had known it the way you know things that live in your bones rather than your mind. She closed the journal. She picked up the coin bags one at a time and carried them to the kitchen wing. Then she went back for the pearls. Then she went back for the journal. Then she sat down on her trunk in the corner of the kitchen with all of it around her, and the small fire going in the hearth, and the smell of smoke and salt in the air, and she did something she had not done since her father's funeral. She cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and completely, the way water finds its level. All the weeks of hard work and cold mornings and not asking for help and not admitting fear came out of her in that hour, sitting on that trunk, in a room she had cleared with her own hands, in a keep she had taken because no one else wanted it. When she was done, she was simply tired, and then she was simply practical again, because there was a great deal to do. The money from Eleanor's chest was not a rescue. That was not how Claire thought about it. It was a tool, like the pry bar, like the chisel. You used tools for what they were meant for, not for what you wished they were. What it was meant for was Ravenstone. She made a list by candlelight that evening. Not a wish list, an assessment. Roof timbers for the kitchen wing. Owen had told her what was needed, and she trusted his eye. Glass for the windows, 6 panes minimum, more if she could afford it. Lime for mortar. Coal for the kitchen hearth to supplement the driftwood, because driftwood alone would not carry her through a Maine winter. A proper door for the kitchen wing entrance, with hardware. Basic tools she didn't have yet. A month's worth of food supplies ordered through the village store, rather than bought piecemeal. She wrote the list in the small account book she'd carried in her coat since she left Portland, the same account book Mrs. Morse had taught her to use. She wrote each item in the left column and the estimated cost in the right. She totaled the columns. She looked at what she had. She looked at what she needed. It was possible. That was all it needed to be. Possible. The next morning she went down to the village and found Owen Pell and told him she wanted to move forward on the kitchen wing roof. She told him what she'd decided about materials. She told him her budget, and she told him it was firm, not as a negotiation, but as information. He nodded. He said he'd have a list by Thursday. She found the woman who ran the general store, Mrs. Cecile Foss, 60 years old, built like someone who had carried things for a long time, and placed a standing weekly order. Flour, salt, dried beans, oats, salt cod, a small quantity of coffee. Mrs. Foss wrote it down without comment. Then she looked at Claire. You wintering up there? She said. Yes. A pause. Mrs. Foss wrote something else in her ledger. I'll add tea, she said. Maine winter, you'll want tea. Claire paid her. The work expanded. By the end of October, Ravenstone had 4 people working on it regularly. Silas, who had appointed himself the unofficial foreman of structural work, and communicated this appointment by simply acting as if it were true. Owen on the kitchen wing roof. Ray Cutler on general clearing and hauling. And a 4th man, introduced by Silas without ceremony as his nephew, Edmund Vane, 26, who didn't say much, but could lift things that would have required 2 of Ray. Claire worked alongside all of them. This was not a philosophical stance. It was practical. She needed to learn what was happening to her building, and the only way to learn it was to do it. She helped pour mortar. She helped stack slate. She hauled stone in a wicker basket until her back told her interesting things about its limits. She watched Owen's hands when he worked with timber, learning how he read grain, how he gauged where wood had gone soft, how he made the decision between repair and replacement. Silas noticed her watching. You've done this before, he said one afternoon. Not a question. Not exactly this, she said, but something like it. Who taught you? The housekeeper at our family property. Mrs. Edna Morse. She paused. She believed that a woman who couldn't maintain her own shelter was at the mercy of whoever was willing to maintain it for her. Silas thought about that. Smart woman, he said. The smartest person I knew, Claire said, and meant it. The evenings she spent with Eleanor's journal. She read it in order from the beginning, one section at a time. She didn't rush it. She treated it the way she treated the building, systematically, with attention, learning the bones of it, before she tried to understand the whole. Eleanor Reed had been a precise observer. She wrote about the weather in detail that was almost meteorological: wind direction, cloud formation, the behavior of the birds before a storm. She wrote about the sea with a familiarity that came from 45 years of watching it from the same vantage point, knowing its moods, the way you know the moods of someone you love and can no longer surprise you. She wrote about the people of Hartwell Cove, not sentimentally, precisely. Who was reliable and who wasn't? Who knew the water and who thought they did? Which fishermen's wives kept good households and which were overwhelmed? She had helped when she could quietly, without announcing it. A loaf of bread left on a porch during a hard winter. A specific piece of advice offered to someone who needed it and hadn't asked for it wrong. She had never thought of herself as part of the village. She thought of herself as adjacent to it, watching, present but separate. Claire recognized that feeling. She had been adjacent her whole life. Adjacent to Hartwell Farm, which was Richard's. Adjacent to a family that had never quite included her. Adjacent to a version of herself that other people had decided she was. Ravenstone was the first thing that had ever been simply, unambiguously hers. The roof on the kitchen wing was finished in the second week of November. Owen had done it exactly right. The original stone slab section was retained and repointed. Where the timber structure beneath it had gone soft, he had scarfed in new oak seasoned wood, not green, brought up from a yard in town. The ceiling inside the kitchen was now tight. No gray light bleeding through. No drip of rain when it rained, and it had rained twice since they started. She stood inside the kitchen wing on the evening it was finished and looked up at the ceiling and felt something she didn't have a name for. Not pride, exactly. Satisfaction was closer. The satisfaction of a problem correctly solved, of the right answer arrived at through the right method. She put her hand against the new timber where it met the old stone. Tight, dry, sound. She thought of Mrs. Morse. She thought of Eleanor Reed. She thought of the entry in the journal from September 1889, and her father sitting in this kitchen, this same room, colder then, rougher, but this same stone and this same hearth, and talking about a daughter he believed in. She would not waste that. It was in the last week of November that the stranger arrived. She noticed him first at the general store. She was collecting her weekly order when she saw him through the window, a man she didn't recognize, in clothes that were too clean for Hartwell Cove. Dark coat, good boots, a hat that had not been purchased in Maine. He was standing on the road outside, looking at nothing in particular, which meant he was looking at everything. She paid Mrs. Foss, carried her basket outside. The man's eyes found her immediately, like he'd been waiting for her specifically, like he knew exactly who she was and had positioned himself to intercept her without making it look like an interception. She knew that kind of calculation. She had watched Richard do it for years. She walked past him without stopping. He fell into step beside her. "Miss Hartwell," he said. Pleasant voice. Too pleasant. The voice of someone who had practiced being pleasant. "Yes. My name is Aldrich. I represent certain interests in Portland with regard to the Ravenstone property." "Whose interests?" A small pause. The length of a decision. "Your brother, among others." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him fully. Aldrich was perhaps 45. Angular face. The look of a man who made his living reading people. He was reading her now. She could feel it. Cataloguing her responses. Measuring them. "What does my brother want?" she said. "A conversation," Aldrich said. "He believes there may have been a misunderstanding regarding the disposition of certain assets connected to the Hartwell estate." Assets. She almost laughed. "There was no misunderstanding," she said. "I signed a deed. The deed is valid, Miss Hartwell." His voice stayed pleasant. That was the tell. When someone works that hard to stay pleasant, they have something they're trying not to show. Your father's estate included several outstanding obligations that were not fully addressed before his death. It has recently come to light that Hartwell Farm was encumbered before the estate was settled. She looked at him. Encumbered, she said. Sold, Aldrich said. His pleasantness slipped, just fractionally. Your father sold Hartwell Farm privately in the autumn of 1893, several months before his death. The proceeds were used to address personal debts. The estate your brother inherited was substantially less than either of you was led to believe. The wind came off the harbor. She stood in it. Hartwell Farm. Sold. Her father had sold the farm, their home, the home where she had grown up, where Mrs. Morse had taught her everything and told no one. Had gone to Portland and signed papers and walked away from it, and then come home and continued as if nothing had changed, and died 8 months later without ever telling her. She thought about September 1889. Her father had come to Ravenstone that September. He had sat with Eleanor Reed. He had talked about Claire as if he were already making provisions, already planning. 2 years later he had added to his will. 2 years after that he had sold the farm. He had known, she realized. He had known for years that the farm was going to have to go. He had been managing a slow financial disaster quietly and alone, the way he managed everything quietly, completely, without burdening anyone else with it. And somewhere in that process, he had made sure that, when it was over, when Richard got what was left and Claire got nothing, Claire would have somewhere to go that was hers, and couldn't be taken. He had not given her the deed. He had made sure it could reach her. The $500 Richard had offered. She understood it now. It was not generosity. It was the last of whatever their father's estate had actually produced. Richard had given her all he could spare. Not all he had, all he could spare. And then he had sent Aldrich. My brother knows about what I found in the tower, she said. Not a question. Aldrich looked at her steadily. He is aware that discoveries were made, he said. He believes certain items found on property that was formerly part of the Hartwell estate's portfolio may constitute family assets under Maine inheritance law. There it was. She looked at him. She thought about Eleanor Reed, writing in her journal for 45 years, keeping the lamp burning on storm nights, meeting her father at the gate and making him coffee and telling him what it meant to learn the bones of a place. She thought about the oilskin-wrapped journal sitting in the tin box on the shelf she had built in the kitchen wing. The journal that documented every year Eleanor had spent on that cliff. The journal that made absolutely clear that Eleanor's estate had been deliberately set aside for the next keeper of Ravenstone. Not the Hartwell family. Not any family. Whoever came next and proved themselves worthy of the trust. Tell my brother, she said, that if he has legal concerns about the property, he is welcome to pursue them through the appropriate channels. She picked up her basket. Sheet. She walked, she did not run. She did not hurry. She walked at exactly the pace she'd been walking before, steady and deliberate, up the road toward the track that led to the headland. Behind her, she heard Aldrich say something else. She didn't stop, didn't turn, because she already knew what was coming, and she was going to be ready. That evening, she sat by the kitchen fire and opened the account book. She looked at the numbers. She looked at what she had spent and what remained. She looked at what she still needed to do. Then she turned to a new page and wrote a single name at the top, Prescott Sims. She would write to him in the morning. She would tell him what Aldrich had said. She would ask about the codicil, the one Sims had mentioned, the one he said he wasn't to discuss unless it became relevant. It was relevant now. She looked at the fire. The chimney still drew a little sideways when the wind was from the northeast. She had a theory about something to do with the height differential between the kitchen wing and the main hall ruin. She was going to ask Silas about it in the morning. Then she was going to write to Sims. Then she was going to go back to work. Because the east window still needed glazing. Because the inner wall of the kitchen needed repointing in the lower third. Because there was a crack in the left side of the kitchen hearth that she'd been watching for 2 weeks, and it had not changed, and probably wasn't structural, but she wanted Silas to look at it anyway. Because Ravenstone had a great deal of work left in it. And so it turned out, did she? Outside, the Atlantic moved in the dark, patient, endless, the same as it had been when Eleanor Reed stood at her window with a lamp in her hand, watching for shapes in the water that might be ships. Up in the tower, not yet restored, not yet lit, the old lamp bracket was still fixed to the stone of the top room window, empty, rusted, waiting. Claire looked at it every time she went up there to check the structural condition of the staircase. She was not ready to light it yet, but she was starting to understand what it meant. The letter from Prescott Sims arrived on a Thursday. Claire was on the roof of the kitchen wing when Edmund brought it up from the village. She came down the ladder with her gloves still on, and her coat dusted with lime, and took it from him without ceremony. Edmund went back to stacking stone. He had learned, in the 2 months he'd been working at Ravenstone, that Claire Hartwell read correspondence the way she did everything else. Quietly, completely, without performing any of it for an audience. She stood in the courtyard and read the letter twice. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, went back up the ladder. Silas watched her from across the courtyard, said nothing. She worked for another 2 hours, repointing the upper course of the kitchen wing's east wall, where the original mortar had gone to powder, and the stones were beginning to rock slightly in their beds. Small movements, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you knew to look, the kind that became serious if you left them another winter. She did not leave things for another winter. When she came down at noon, she told Silas. "Sims is coming," she said. "He has documents he says I need to see in person." Silas poured coffee from the battered pot he'd started bringing up from 3 weeks ago without being asked, because he had decided the working conditions at Ravenstone were insufficiently caffeinated, and this was a problem he could solve. He handed her a cup. "When?" he said. "Next Tuesday," he nodded. Drank his coffee. Looked at the east wall she'd been working on. "You got the upper course before the freeze," he said. That was the right call. She knew it was. She didn't say so. She just drank her coffee and looked at the wall and thought about Prescott Sims and what he was carrying up from Portland in a document case. Tuesday came gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, the kind of November sky that meant business. Sims arrived in the early afternoon on a hired wagon from town, which meant he'd taken the morning train north and hired transport from the station. He was wearing his good overcoat. He was carrying a leather case that he held with both hands, the way people carry things that are either very heavy or very important. He stood in the courtyard of Ravenstone Keep and looked around him. She watched his face. He had been to this property before years ago, in his professional capacity, when the Ashford estate had asked him to document the outstanding obligation. He had seen it then as it was a ruin, a liability, a thing to be managed away. She could see him recalibrating now. The cleared courtyard, the repointed walls, the new roof on the kitchen wing, its slate dark with recent rain, solid and trim, the glazed windows throwing back the gray afternoon light, the smoke from the kitchen chimney rising straight up in the still air. "Miss Hartwell?" he said. "Mr. Sims," she gestured toward the kitchen door, "come inside." She put coffee on. He sat down at the table she'd built from salvaged timber, rough, functional, perfectly level, because she had made Owen check it with his spirit level before she'd been satisfied. Sims set his case on the table and folded his hands over it and looked at her in a way that told her the next part of this conversation was going to require his full concentration. She sat across from him and waited. "Your brother," Sims began, "has filed a claim in Cumberland County Probate Court. The claim asserts that assets discovered on the Ravenstone property constitute recoverable estate assets under the general inheritance statutes, on the grounds that the property itself was transferred in settlement of an obligation incurred by your father. He's saying the debt was a family debt," she said. "So anything that came from settling it is family property, essentially. And is he right?" Sims opened his case. He took out a document, set it on the table between them, facing her. "Your father," he said, "came to my office in February of 1891. He made a specific addition to his existing will. Not a new will, an addendum. 1 page," he pointed. This she read. It was in her father's handwriting, or rather, it was a witnessed and notarized copy, but she recognized the phrasing. The particular way her father constructed sentences, always a little more formal than necessary, the formality of someone who had learned early that informal things could be ignored. The addendum read, "Any property transferred to Claire Ann Hartwell by direct deed, whether in settlement of obligation, or by gift, or by any other legal mechanism, shall be considered the separate and sole property of," said Claire Ann Hartwell, under the provisions of the Maine Married Women's Property Act of 1844 and its subsequent amendments, which protections this addendum extends by private covenant to unmarried women of legal majority, and shall not be subject to claim by any other party connected to the Hartwell estate. She looked at it for a long time. "He wrote this in 1891, she said. "February 14th, 1891. Sims paused. 2 years before he sold the farm. 18 months before he added the Ravenstone obligation to Ashford's account. He was already planning. He knew the farm was going to have to go. He knew what Richard would do. And he made sure that whatever reached you, however it reached you, was legally untouchable." She set the document down. She looked at her hands flat on the table. Her father had sat in Sims's office in February of 1891 winter. Portland, probably cold, probably one of those flat gray February days that felt like they had no beginning or end, and written this. Had thought it through carefully enough to reference the specific statute. Had known enough about Maine property law to anchor it to something real. Because he was not a practical man in any conventional sense. He was a man who loved history books and forgot the names of workmen. But he had loved her, and love sometimes makes practical men out of impractical ones. "Will it hold?" she said. "I believe it will," Sims said. "I also believe Richard's lawyers know it will hold, which is why they are pursuing the probate angle rather than a direct property challenge." He paused. "They are hoping to tie up the estate long enough to make the legal costs prohibitive." She understood. She was not wealthy. She had Eleanor's money, but Eleanor's money was finite. A sustained legal battle could drain it faster than the building work had. "How long?" she said. "If we file a motion to dismiss on the basis of the addendum, the court will schedule a hearing. That could be 6 weeks, could be 3 months. Depends on the judge's calendar." Sims looked at her steadily. "I should also tell you that Richard intends to appear at the hearing himself. He is not sending Aldrich this time." Something in her chest tightened. "He's coming here to Portland for the hearing." Sims paused. "He may also come to Harwick Cove before then. I cannot tell you what he intends." She looked at the addendum on the table. February 14th, 1891. Her father had given her this, had given it to her years before she needed it, sealed it with proper witnesses, and left it with Sims with instructions, and trusted that Sims would know when to use it. "File the motion," she said. "I will need a small retainer to begin," Sims said. He named a figure. It was not small, exactly, but it was manageable. She went to the shelf where she kept the account book. She counted out the amount in federal notes, exact, and placed it on the table. Sims looked at the money, then at her. "Your father would be pleased," he said. She didn't answer that, not because it wasn't kind, because it made her throat close in a way she didn't have time for right now. She showed him out, watched the wagon go back down the track toward the village. Then she went back inside and stood at the kitchen table and looked at the copy of the addendum Sims had left her. February 14th, Valentine's Day. She almost laughed. Her father, who had been hopeless at remembering birthdays and had never once successfully purchased an appropriate gift for any occasion in his entire life, had accidentally written his daughter's most important legal protection on Valentine's Day. She folded it carefully and put it in the tin document box with Eleanor's papers. The work continued. Not because she was not afraid. She was afraid. The hearing was real, and the costs were real, and Richard's determination was real, in a way that his indifference had never been. When Richard didn't care about something, he ignored it. When he cared, he was methodical and thorough, and he did not stop. But fear was just information. She had learned that, and the information fear was giving her was, do not stop. Do not give him anything that looks like vulnerability. Do not let the work slow down. So it didn't. December came. The temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there. The harbor iced over at the edges. The village pulled inward the way coastal villages do in winter, less visible, more concentrated, the smoke from chimneys the main evidence that people were still there. Owen finished the interior work on the kitchen wing, the walls fully repointed, the hearth repaired, the shelving done. The kitchen was now a real room. Warm, dry, the kind of room that stayed 10 degrees warmer than the outside, because the stone had finally absorbed enough heat to give it back. She had glazed all 6 windows. She had hung a proper door, solid oak, with iron hardware Owen had sourced from a smithy 2 towns north. She had built, with Edmund's help, and under Silas's supervision, a raised bed kitchen garden in the sheltered angle of the standing walls of the main hall ruin. She had mulched it for winter with seaweed hauled up from the cove. Eleanor's journal had mentioned the same practice, noting that the kelp kept the frost from going too deep and enriched the soil as it broke down. She had read that entry and then done exactly what Eleanor had done. Because Eleanor had spent 45 years figuring out what worked on this cliff, and there was no point in not learning from her. Silas came every day. She had stopped thinking of this as unusual. He arrived at 7 or 7:30, depending on the tide, and whether he'd been down to the waterfront first. He assessed what needed doing. He worked. He drank 3 cups of coffee over the course of the day. He went home before dark. He said approximately 40 words on a busy day. She had come to value those 40 words more than most people's 400. One evening in mid-December, she came down from the tower. She had been checking the staircase, assessing which treads needed replacement, and found him still in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table with his hands around a cup of cold coffee, which was unusual. He usually left before the coffee went cold. He usually didn't sit idle. She sat down across from him. He looked at the table. "Your brother was in the village today," he said. She went still. "He came down the track from the station," Silas said. "Walked through the village. Went into the general store. Asked Mrs. Foss questions about you. About the property. About who came and went. Did she answer him? She told him she ran a store, not an information office, and if he wanted gossip he could try the tavern." A pause. "He went to the tavern." She almost smiled. Almost. "Did he come up to Ravenstone?" "He stood at the bottom of the track and looked up at it for about 10 minutes, Silas said. Then he got back in his hired wagon and left." She thought about that. Richard standing at the bottom of the cliff track, looking up at the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, the glazed windows, the new gate Owen had hung in the curtain wall gap, seeing that she was still there, seeing that she had not run. She thought that must have been a specific kind of frustrating for a man like Richard Hartwell, who had spent most of their shared life assuming that she would eventually go away. "All right," she said. Silas looked at her. "You're not worried," he said. "I'm worried," she said. "But worrying won't fix the 3rd tread on the tower staircase, and that tread is a problem." She looked at him. "Can you look at it tomorrow?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, because Silas Vane did not really do smiles, but something adjacent to one. "Tomorrow?" he said. "Early." Richard came to Hartwell Cove in the 2nd week of January. Not in a hired wagon this time. He came in a proper carriage, which was an unusual sight on the village road, and he brought a young man with him who carried a leather portfolio and who was self-evidently a lawyer's clerk, not a lawyer, which meant Richard was sending a message. He was not here for a conversation. He was here to be seen and to see. Claire heard about the carriage from Edmund, who heard about it from his wife, who had seen it from her kitchen window at 7:30 in the morning and reported it to the entire eastern end of the village within 20 minutes. That was how information moved in Hartwell Cove. Faster than telegram, nearly as accurate. She was in the courtyard when Richard came through the gate. She had not planned to be in the courtyard. She had been moving stone. There was a section of fallen curtain wall on the north side that she had been wanting to address since October, and December had been too cold for mortar work, and today was January, but it was a cold clear day rather than a cold wet day, and she had decided to at least sort the fallen stone into usable and unusable piles. So she was in the courtyard, in her work coat, with her hair pinned up under a wool cap, and her gloves on, when Richard walked through the gate. He stopped. He looked at her. At the courtyard. At the kitchen wing behind her, the solid roof, the glazed windows, the smoke from the chimney. At the tower rising beyond everything, dark stone against the January sky. He looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he looked at her again. "Claire," he said. "Richard," she said. His clerk hovered behind him, portfolio clutched, looking like someone who wished he were somewhere warmer. Richard had their father's height and none of his warmth. He was 41 years old and looked it not badly, not in a way that spoke of dissipation, but in the way of a man who had worked hard at things that didn't ask him to feel anything, and whose face showed it. He wore his success carefully, like a coat that fit correctly but hadn't been broken in yet. He looked at the stone she'd been sorting. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes. This is impressive." He said it as if it cost him something, as if he had told himself he would not say it, and then said it anyway because lying about what he was seeing felt too foolish. "I didn't think you'd actually stay?" He was quiet. "I stayed," she said. "I stayed and I worked and I rebuilt it. And now your lawyers are trying to take it." She said this without heat, without performance. Just the facts, in order. "It's not personal," Richard said. She almost laughed. The exact words she'd expected. The words people say when they are doing something very personal and want it to feel like administration. "I know what you found in the tower," he said. "Aldrich's people were thorough. I'm sure they were. That money belonged to the estate." "It didn't," she said. "And you know it didn't, and your lawyers know it didn't, and the judge will know it when Sims files the motion." She looked at him. "You're not here because you think you'll win the case, Richard. You're here because you want to see if I'll flinch." A long pause. The wind came off the Atlantic and moved across the courtyard and went on. "You've become harder," he said. Not unkindly. Observationally. "I've become clearer," she said. "It's different." He looked at the tower again. She watched his face while he looked at it, saw him add something up, come to some conclusion. "The hearing is set for February," he said. "I know. Sims is old. He's thorough," she said. "Age doesn't change that." Richard looked at her for a final moment. Something passed across his face, she couldn't name it exactly. Not regret, not guilt. More like the particular expression of someone who has been very certain about something for a long time and has just been introduced to a piece of evidence that requires reconsideration. He left. The clerk went with him. The carriage went back down the track. Silas came out from the kitchen doorway, where he had been standing, very still, within earshot. She looked at him. "You were listening," she said. "Yes," he said. She nodded. Turned back to the stone she'd been sorting. He came and stood beside her and started sorting stone too. That was the end of January. February brought the hearing date closer and the temperature lower, and Harwick Cove contracted further into itself. Wood smoke and lamplight and the creak of boats against ice in the harbor. Claire worked through it. The north curtain wall section, repointed. A second raised bed in the kitchen garden, framed and filled and mulched. She began to teach herself timber framing. From a manual Owen had loaned her dry reading, technical, the kind of text that required a pencil and several readings before it gave up its information. She read it. At night by the fire, she wrote to Mrs. Morse. She had been meaning to for months. She had started three letters and not finished any of them, which was unlike her. She finished things, but each time she sat down to write, she found herself uncertain about what to say. Not about the facts. The facts were easy. It was the other part that was hard. The part where she tried to explain what Ravenstone had done to her, or what she had done to Ravenstone, or how the two things had become so entangled she wasn't sure they could be separated. She sat down in February and wrote the letter all the way through. She told Mrs. Morse about Eleanor Reed, about the journal, about the hidden room and the chest, and the 45 years of a woman alone on a cliff keeping a lamp burning for sailors who didn't know her name. She told her about Silas Vane and Owen Pell and Edmund and Ray Cutler. She told her about the roof and the windows and the kitchen garden, and the first time she'd had a fire in the tower hearth and felt the whole circular room breathe with warmth. She told her about the addendum, about what her father had done, about February 14th, 1891. She told her, "I think I finally understand what you meant about bones." She sent the letter on the Tuesday mail wagon. It was the third week of February when the keg of lamp oil in the storage shed caught fire. She was in the tower when it happened, up on the second floor, Checking the window frames, the stone sills were sound, but she'd been seeing moisture at the lower corners, and she wanted to know if it was the frame joints or the pointing. She smelled the smoke before she saw it. Sharp and chemical and wrong. The smell of something burning that was not meant to burn. Not wood smoke from a hearth, but something hotter and more urgent. She was down the stairs and out the door in seconds. The storage shed was on the far side of the kitchen wing, tucked against the curtain wall. She had been using it to store materials, timber offcuts, lime bags, rags, 2 5-gallon kegs of lamp oil she'd laid in for the winter. It was fully engaged when she came around the corner of the kitchen wing. Orange and roaring, the sound of it enormous in the cold air, the curtain wall behind it already blackening with soot. She ran for the water barrels. There were 3 of them, positioned at different points of the courtyard. She had set them up in October after doing the risk assessment that Mrs. Morse had drilled into her. You always know where your water is. Always. She got the first barrel's hand pump working and aimed it at the base of the fire, not the top, the way you were supposed to, fighting the urge to spray it everywhere, because everywhere felt more satisfying and less effective. Silas appeared from the direction of the gate. He had a second hand pump. She didn't ask how he'd gotten there so fast. She just pointed at the right side of the blaze. Edmund was 30 seconds behind him. Ray Cutler behind Edmund. They were 4 people against a fully engaged storage fire with 3 water barrels and no professional apparatus. They kept it from spreading. That was what they did. Not extinguish it. The shed was gone. The timber and lime bags and the rags were gone. One of the oil kegs had already gone, and the second went with a low, heavy whump that pushed the heat back at them in a wave. But they kept it from reaching the kitchen wing wall, kept it from the courtyard's accumulated lumber pile, kept it contained. It took 40 minutes. When it was out, or what was left of it was out, she stood in the courtyard with her coat burned along the left sleeve, and her face hot and raw, and her hands aching from the pump handle, and looked at the wet black ruin of the shed. She said nothing. Silas stood beside her. He was looking at the base of the shed wall, or what had been the base of the shed wall, looking at something specific. 3 points, he said, quietly. Just to her. She looked. She saw what he saw. You had to know what to look for. The burn pattern, at the base. The way the char ran in 3 distinct lines from 3 distinct starting points, not the spreading single origin of an accidental fire. 3 starts. Deliberately placed, she breathed in cold January air and breathed out slowly. No wind last night, Silas said. No, she said. Lamp oil doesn't ignite itself. No, she said, it doesn't. She looked at the pattern for a long time. Memorized it. She was going to describe it to Sims, in writing, in precise language, and she was going to do it today, before the details went soft in her memory. She turned to the others. Owen had arrived at some point during the fire, she hadn't noticed exactly when. He was standing slightly back, soot on his coat, looking at the same thing she'd been looking at. Ray Cutler was quiet. Edmund was quiet. Thank you, she said. All of you. Ray Cutler said, You need anything, Miss Hartwell. Anything at all. She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell the difference by now, between the things people said and the things people meant. I need to rebuild the storage shed, she said, and I need to do it before the next supply delivery. He nodded. We'll start tomorrow, he said. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and wrote to Sims. 3 pages. She described the fire, the origin points, the timing, the pattern. She described her storage contents and their value. She stated, plainly and without embellishment, that she believed the fire was deliberately set, and that she believed she knew who had set it, or caused it to be set, though she could not prove this and was not claiming proof. She was claiming evidence, which was different, which was what courts worked with. She sealed the letter and gave it to Edmund to take to the mail wagon. Then she put her coat on and went back outside. The shed ruins were still steaming slightly in the cold air. The curtain wall behind it was scorched black from ground level to about 8 feet up, but the stone itself was intact. Stone doesn't burn. She had known that, but knowing it and seeing it were different things. The curtain wall had held. The kitchen wing had held. Ravenstone had held. She looked at the blackened wall. She thought about Eleanor Reed, riding out 45 years of storms on this cliff. Not because there was no difficulty, because she had made the decision and then she had kept making it, every morning, every winter, every storm. That was what staying was. Not one choice, hundreds of them. She thought about her father. February 14th, 1891. She thought about Mrs. Morse. Learn its bones, and it will keep you warm when everything else goes cold. She picked up a piece of undamaged timber from the lumber pile and carried it to where the shed had been and set it down. First piece. First decision. Start building. Behind her, she heard boots on stone. Owen, coming around the corner of the kitchen wing with his timber assessment face on, already looking at what was salvageable. Ray Cutler behind him with a handcart. Edmund behind Ray. She didn't turn around. She already knew they were there. I want the footprint shifted 6 inches north, she said. Keep it off the curtain wall. Better air gap. Better fire break too, Owen said. Yes. He came to stand beside her and looked at the ground where she'd set the timber. 6 inches, he said. Good call. They started measuring. The February hearing was 8 days away. She had Sims's addendum. She had 3 pages of fire evidence. She had the journal, sealed in oilskin in its tin box, documenting 45 years of Eleanor Reed's legitimate occupancy and the deliberate provisions she had made. She had Silas Vane. She wasn't certain what she had in Silas Vane. Exactly. She knew he had been present at the ceiling of the tower in 1866. She knew he knew things he had not yet said. She knew he had watched her since the day she'd arrived, reading her the way he read stone patiently, taking his time, reaching a conclusion through observation rather than assumption. She did not know yet whether he would speak. But she was beginning to think that whatever he was waiting for, whatever signal or threshold or proof of worthiness he had been applying, quietly, without stating it, she was beginning to think she had crossed it. The night before she left for Portland, she went up to the top of the tower. She stood at the window, looked out at the harbor, the village lights below, the dark Atlantic beyond. The lamp bracket was there beside her, empty, waiting. She reached into her coat pocket. She had carried a small oil lamp up with her and a box of matches. She had not known, when she started up the stairs, that she was going to light it, but she was here now. She filled the bracket lamp, struck a match, held it to the wick. The flame caught, small at first, then steady. She stepped back. The light went out through the window over the dark water. Not a lighthouse beam, not an official signal, just a lamp, just a small, steady point of light in the dark above the harbor. She thought about Eleanor Reed, standing in this exact spot, doing this exact thing, for 45 years. And she thought, I understand now. She left the lamp burning, went downstairs, packed what she needed for Portland. The hearing was in 8 days. She was ready. The night before the hearing, Claire did not sleep. Not because she was afraid. She was afraid, but that wasn't why she was awake. She lay on the cot in the Portland boarding house, with her hands flat on her stomach, and stared at the ceiling and felt the particular wakefulness of someone whose mind had decided that now, right now in the dark, was the time to go over everything again. Every document, every date, every word Sims had said, every possible thing Richard's lawyers might raise that she had not prepared for, which was the problem. She didn't know what she hadn't prepared for. That was the thing about Richard. He didn't improvise. He built. He prepared. He came to things with everything arranged in advance, and the only way to counter that was to have done the same. And she believed she had done the same. But believing something at 2 a.m. in a strange room, with the hearing 8 hours away, was not the same as knowing it. She got up at 4:30, made herself presentable, packed her document case, ate a breakfast she did not taste at the boarding house table. The woman who ran the place set it in front of her, without comment, eggs, toast, coffee, and looked at her once and did not ask questions, which was exactly the right thing to do. She walked to Sims's office. It was dark. Of course it was dark. It was 5:45 in the morning. She sat on the steps and waited. He found her there at 7:10, which meant he had not slept particularly well either, or had slept and woken early, or had this morning required him before he was usually required. He looked at her on his steps, looked at his watch, did not comment on either. Come in, he said. They went through everything one final time. The addendum, the chain of title, the journal entries. She had selected Eleanor's accounting of the 45 years, the September 1889 entry about her father, the passages about the provisions Eleanor had made, and what she intended them to mean. Sims had prepared a summary, 6 pages, spare and precise, the kind of legal prose that said exactly what was needed and nothing more. Their case, she said. Aggressive, he said. They'll argue the addendum is invalid. Your father extended protections to an unmarried woman by private covenant that's unusual. Creative, I called it. They'll call it overreach. Can they prove that? They can argue it. Whether the judge agrees is different. He paused. We need a clean line between Eleanor Reed's estate and the Hartwell estate. The journal helps, but a journal is personal. Richard's lawyers will say Eleanor could have written anything she liked. What I need is a witness. Someone with direct knowledge of what Eleanor placed in that room and why. She looked at him. She had known this was coming. She had known it. Since January, since the fire, since the night she had stood at the tower window and understood what it meant to keep making the same decision every morning. She had known, and she had not yet asked Silas directly, because asking directly meant he could say no, and she had not been ready for no. She was ready now. I have someone, she said. Who? Silas Vane. Harwick Cove. He sealed the tower in 1866 at Eleanor Reed's direction. He was there. He saw what was in that room before he walled it up. She paused. He's been waiting to say it to the right person. I think I'm the right person, but I haven't asked him yet. Sims looked at her steadily. The hearing is today. I know when the hearing is. A pause. He looked at the clock on his mantel. Court convenes at 10, he said. If this man is coming, he needs to be here by 9:30. Absolute latest. Another pause. How far is Harwick Cove from Portland? 2.5 hours by hired carriage from the station. The morning train from Harwick leaves at 5:45. It was 7:14. If he's coming, Sims said, he's already on the train or he isn't coming. She was already standing. She walked to the telegraph office. It opened at 7:30. She was outside at 7:16, in the February cold, watching a clerk unlock the door from the inside. He looked at her through the glass with the expression of someone who had not yet had coffee and was already being asked for things. He let her in at 7:22. She had been composing the telegram since January. She wrote it in under a minute. Silas Vane, Harwick Cove, Maine. Hearing today, 10 a.m. Portland Courthouse. I need you to speak. If you are coming, you must be on the 5:45 from Harwick. I believe you have been waiting for the right moment. This is it. Claire Hartwell. She handed it over. Paid, walked out. Either he was on the train or he wasn't. She had done everything she could do and now there was nothing left to do, and that was the hardest part. She was a person who fixed things. When something was broken, she found the break and addressed it. This was not a break she could address. This was a door she had knocked on, and now she had to wait to see if it opened. She walked back to the boarding house, sat in the parlor, read the same paragraph of the same newspaper 4 times. At 8:45 she walked to the courthouse. She did not look toward the train station. Looking would not change anything. Richard arrived at 9 o'clock precisely. 2 lawyers with him, younger men, the thoroughly prepared kind, carrying too many folders. Richard looked at her across the courthouse steps. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. He looked like he had slept well, which meant he was confident, which meant his lawyers had told him the case was strong. She went inside. Sims was at the respondent's table. She sat beside him, set her document case down, folded her hands on top of it. She did not look at the door. The judge entered at 9:58. Judge Hartley Osgood, 63 years old, the kind of judge who had been doing this long enough to have opinions about everything and the experience to keep those opinions mostly off his face. He settled into his chair, adjusted his papers, looked around the courtroom with calm, unhurried attention. We're here on the matter of Hartwell versus Hartwell, he said. Probate challenge, Cumberland County. Counsel, are we ready? Richard's lead lawyer, Fowler, stood. Ready, Your Honor. Sims stood. Ready, Your Honor. A pause. The respondent expects a witness. We are awaiting his arrival. He is traveling from the coast. Fowler's eyebrows moved. Just slightly. Judge Osgood looked at Sims over his glasses. Awaiting his arrival, he said, "Yes, Your Honor. He was expected on the morning train, which I understand arrived." The door opened. Silas Vane did not make entrances. He was not built for drama. He was 68 years old, a Maine coast mason who had spent his whole life doing practical things and saying the minimum required to accomplish them. He walked through the door of the Portland courthouse, in his good coat, dark wool, brushed, the coat you wore when things mattered, and he looked around the room until he found Claire, and he walked to the seat behind the respondent's table, and he put his hat on his knee, and he looked at the judge. That was all. But Claire felt something release in her chest that had been sitting there since 4:30 in the morning. She turned back to face forward. Sims sat down. His hands were steady on the table. The hearing began. Fowler was good. She acknowledged it. He built the case the way you build a wall, methodically, one course at a time, each piece supporting the next. The Hartwell estate, the outstanding obligation to Ashford, the transfer mechanism, the discovery of assets in the tower, the inheritance statutes, and then his main angle, the one Sims had predicted, the addendum. Your father, he argued, did not have the authority to create this protection by private covenant. The language was inventive but legally unsupported. Without the addendum, the assets discovered at Ravenstone were estate assets, and the estate belonged to Richard Hartwell. Neat, logical, well constructed. She watched Judge Osgood while Fowler talked. The judge made notes. His face gave nothing away. She had no idea how to read judges. She had spent years reading buildings and people with reasonable accuracy, but judges were a different category entirely. Sims stood. He did not match Fowler's pace. He moved at his own pace, which was deliberate and slightly slower than you expected, and which made everything he said feel considered. He was 60 years old and had been in this courthouse more times than he could count, and he did not need to perform confidence. He walked the court through the addendum, the specific statute, the history of the Maine Married Women's Property Act and its amendments, the precedents under which private covenants extending similar protections had been upheld elsewhere in New England. He was precise, thorough, the particular boring of someone who knows the details so well they don't need to dress them up. Then he said, the respondent also asks the court to consider the question of whose property was found in that tower. The petitioner claims estate assets. The respondent contends these items were the separate property of Eleanor Reed, who occupied Ravenstone Keep from 1848 until her death in 1893, and who made deliberate provisions for their disposition. We have documentary evidence. We also have a witness. Judge Osgood looked up. Call your witness, Mr. Sims. Silas Vane stood. He walked to the front of the courtroom the same way he walked everywhere. Straight, unhurried. The walk of a man who had been moving across uncertain terrain his whole life and had stopped being surprised by it. He was sworn in. He sat in the witness chair. He put his hat on his knee again and looked at Sims and waited. Mr. Vane, Sims said, please state your occupation and your connection to the Ravenstone property. Mason, Silas said. I've worked stone on the Maine coast for 50 years. Born in Harwick Cove and I live there now. He paused. I knew Eleanor Reed from the time I was a young man. I did work for her at Ravenstone several times over the years, including one specific occasion in 1866. Yes. Can you describe that occasion for the court? Silas was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, organizing the way he organized any job. In the winter of 1866, he said, Mrs. Reed came to my workshop. She was then in her late 40s, and she'd been living at Ravenstone alone for close to 18 years since her husband was lost at sea. She hired me to do a specific job. She wanted the entrance to the sea tower sealed, filled in, built to look like part of the existing wall. He paused. She told me what materials to use. Natural hydraulic cement, locally sourced aggregate. She wanted it to last, and she knew enough about masonry to specify how. Did she explain why she wanted the entrance sealed? She said she had personal property inside the tower she wanted protected. She was getting older. She said she couldn't guarantee she'd always be strong enough to turn someone away if they decided to help themselves. But she didn't want to remove what was there. He looked at his hands for a moment. She said the right person would eventually find it, and the wrong person would look at a solid wall and walk away. Were you present when Eleanor Reed placed the contents of that room?
No, Fro.
She'd done that herself years before I sealed the entrance. She showed me the room and what was in it before I built the wall. Said I needed to understand what I was protecting. And what did you see in that room, Mr. Vane? Silas looked at something across the courtroom that wasn't quite a person or a wall. The middle distance of a memory. A wooden chest, he said. Iron-bound at the corners. She opened it. There were coin bags inside, gold and silver. Federal coinage, her husband's savings from his years running cargo on the coast. A small leather pouch with pearls in it. Gifts from her husband over the years, she told me. And a tin box. He paused. She said the tin box held her journals. Every year she'd been at Ravenstone. She said it was the only true account of her life, and she wanted it to go to whoever came next. Sims let that settle. Across the room Fowler was writing. Fast. In your understanding, Sims said, were those items the property of Eleanor Reed? They were everything she had, Silas said. Her husband's savings, her journals, the pearls, everything she'd held onto for 18 years on that cliff. Yes. Hers. Did she state her intentions for these items? She said she had no family left to leave them to. She said the property should go to whoever came to Ravenstone next, and prove they were willing to do what she'd done. Stay. Work. Keep the lamp burning in the tower for the fishermen. He paused. She was clear it wasn't about blood or name. She said family hadn't served her, and she had no reason to serve it back. It was about the person. What they did when they got there. And you kept this information for 28 years. She asked me not to speak of it, and I didn't. Simple. Complete. Not until the right person came. Nothing further, Your Honor. Fowler stood. He was thorough. He challenged the reliability of a 28-year-old memory. He pointed out there was no documentation of the 1,800 as in 66 arrangement, no receipt, no written contract, nothing. He suggested Silas might be motivated by personal loyalty to Claire Hartwell. Silas answered each question in the same tone. Even. Unhurried. The tone of someone who knows what they know and sees no need to defend it because it is simply what it is. On memory, I remember every job that mattered in 50 years. I remember the dimensions of that opening, the height of the ceiling in that hidden room, the specific stones I chose for the fill and why I chose them. A man doesn't forget the work he's most proud of. I was proud of that wall. I built it right. On documentation, she paid me in cash. That's how Eleanor Reed did business, and it's how I did business. I don't know what the absence of paperwork is meant to prove. On loyalty, I knew Eleanor Reed for 30 years. I've known Claire Hartwell for 4 months. It's Eleanor I'm speaking for today. Fowler sat down. Judge Osgood looked at his notes. He looked at Silas. One question from the court, Mr. Vane. He leaned forward slightly. In your assessment as someone who knew Eleanor Reed over many years, do you believe she intended the contents of that room to pass to a particular family or bloodline, or to something else? Silas looked at the judge directly. Something else, he said. She was very specific. She said family wasn't the point. She wanted someone who would do what she had done. Not own the place like property. Tend it like a responsibility. Keep the light for people who needed it. He paused. She said whoever the right person was, they'd make themselves known by not leaving. The wrong person would see a ruin and go. Judge Osgood wrote something. Silas was excused. He walked back and sat down behind Claire. He set his hat on his knee. He caught her eye for a single moment and gave her the smallest possible nod, and she turned back to face forward, because if she didn't, she was going to do something she would regret in a courthouse. Arguments concluded just before noon. Judge Osgood did not recess. He reviewed his notes for 4 minutes. She counted them, each one the length of a year. Then he looked up. This court finds as follows. Level voice. The voice of a man delivering a decision, not performing one. Regarding the addendum to the Hartwell estate will, the court finds this document valid and enforceable. The private covenant language is unusual, but not without precedent in Maine property law, and the intent is unambiguous. Ravenstone Keep, transferred to Claire Ann Hartwell by direct deed, is her separate and sole property. and is not subject to estate claims by any other party. Fowler's pen stopped, regarding the assets discovered in the Ravenstone Tower. The court finds that the testimony presented today, combined with the documentary evidence, establishes to this court's satisfaction that these items were the separate property of Eleanor Reed, placed by her in deliberate and considered provision for their future disposition, and do not form part of any Hartwell estate obligation. They pass, in accordance with Eleanor Reed's clearly expressed intent, to the current and lawful occupant of Ravenstone Keep. He set his papers down. The petitioner's claims are dismissed in their entirety. He stood. All rise. Everyone stood. Judge Osgood walked out. Claire sat down, or her knees sat her down. She was standing, and then she was sitting, and the transition had happened without her full participation. The hearing room was doing its after-business sounds, papers gathering, chairs moving, the low-register conversation of lawyers comparing notes, all of it at a great remove. Sims set his hand briefly on the table beside hers. Not on her hand. Beside it. The gesture of a professional who wanted to acknowledge something without overstepping. "Well done," he said quietly. She nodded. She was not ready to speak yet. Across the room, Richard stood with Fowler and the second lawyer. They were talking with their heads together, the conversation of a team processing a loss. Richard's face was turned slightly away. Then he turned. He looked at her across the room. She had been prepared for the look she'd known all her life. The assessing look. The arithmetic look. The look that said she was a variable in his calculation. It wasn't there. What was there instead was harder to name. She had seen something close to it in January, when he'd stood in the Ravenstone courtyard and looked at the solid roof and the glazed windows and said, "You've been busy," as if the words surprised him on their way out. She had seen it then and set it aside. She saw it now in full. It was the expression of a man who had held a very fixed idea about his sister, for his entire adult life, about what she was capable of, about what she was worth, about what she would do when pressed, and who had spent this morning watching that idea fail every test it was put to. Not dramatically, just steadily, witness by witness, document by document, quiet answer by quiet answer. He was not a man who apologized. She did not expect that. She did not particularly want it. But he looked at her, and for the first time in her memory, he looked at her without the arithmetic. He put his hat on, walked out. His lawyers followed. The heavy doors swung shut, and the room was quieter without him in it. On the other side of the room, near the back wall, Harlan Ashford stood. She had not noticed him come in. She did not know when he had arrived or how long he had been there. He was 52 years old, and he looked at a man who had managed considerable property and considerable disappointments, and wore both with a certain careful composure. He had signed the deed to Ravenstone the way he signed unpleasant paperwork, with efficiency and without looking too closely at what he was signing away. He met her eyes across the room. He did not apologize either. She had not expected that from him any more than from Richard. He nodded once. Deliberate. Not a social nod. Not the automatic acknowledgement of one acquaintance to another. The specific nod of a man who has witnessed something he did not anticipate and is adjusting his understanding accordingly. She nodded back. That was all. But it was something. She went to find Silas. He was in the corridor outside, standing by the window that looked out over the street, watching Portland go about its Wednesday. She stood beside him, and they both looked out at the street for a moment, without saying anything. "Train back leaves at 2, he said. "I know," she said. They walked to the station. There was a lunch counter. She had a bowl of chowder that she actually tasted, actually paid attention to, because her mind was no longer consuming every available resource on what was about to happen. It had happened. Her mind was slowly, cautiously releasing its grip. Silas had coffee and a piece of apple pie, which he ate with the same focused patience he brought to everything. She looked at him across the small table. "Why today?" she said. He looked at his coffee. "You could have come to me in October," she said. "In November. You could have told me everything in the first week and I would have gone straight to Sims." He was quiet. Outside, the February street moved past the window. A cart horse. 2 women with their coats pulled tight. A boy delivering something to the shop across the way. Eleanor waited 45 years for the right person, he said. Seemed reasonable I could wait a few months to be sure you were who she'd been waiting for. And when did you know? He thought about it the way he thought about everything. Properly. The fire, he said. The morning after. You were already measuring for the new shed before the ashes were cold. He paused. Eleanor did the same thing. Twice. When the roof section over the east room collapsed in 1871, she was back up there with salvage timber the next morning. When a storm took out her kitchen garden in 1879, she rebuilt the beds by the end of the week. He looked at Claire. She would have recognized you. That's what I kept thinking. She would have known you right away. Claire looked at her hands around the coffee mug. There were calluses on her palms now that hadn't been there in October. Lime dust had permanently lightened the skin around her knuckles. Her hands looked like the hands of someone who did real work, which was what they were. Mrs. Morse had hands like that. Eleanor Reed had hands like that, almost certainly. She never knew I existed, Claire said. She died a year before my father did. She knew you'd exist, Silas said. She trusted your father's word. That was enough for her. The 2:00 train came. They rode back to the coast, in the quiet of two people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. The Maine countryside went past the windows, farms and forest and ledge, the long descent toward the sea. The air changed as they went north, gaining weight and salt, the particular sharpness of the coast asserting itself through the gaps in the window frame. She watched it and thought about making this journey in October. The same train line going the other direction. Her trunk in the rack above. The deed folded in her pocket. $10 in her glove. She had not known then that there was a Silas Vane. Had not known there was an Eleanor Reed, or a hidden room, or a chest, or 45 years of journals. Had not known about her father's visit, or the conversation he'd had in Eleanor's kitchen, or the thing he'd said about her that had made Eleanor trust a stranger's word across a 12-year span of silence. She had just refused $500. Sometimes it started that small. One refusal. One moment of knowing what you were worth when someone else had done the math and come up with a different answer. One folded deed, one trunk on a cart road going north. They reached Harwick Cove at 4:30. The light was going. February light, thin and silver, dropping fast. The harbor was steel-colored. The village was lit yellow windows, the smell of wood smoke bending south on a light wind off the water. She looked up toward the headland. Ravenstone Keep stood against the last of the sky. The kitchen wing chimney, the curtain wall, the tower rising above everything, dark stone going darker in the fading light. The tower window was dark. Of course it was. She had lit the lamp the night before and left at first light. The oil in a small lamp would last 6 hours at most. She had known this when she lit it. She had lit it anyway, because some things you do for the gesture rather than the duration. And Edmund had said, when she told him she was leaving for Portland, that he would look in on the place. She would ask him tomorrow if he'd thought to carry oil up to the tower. But looking at the dark window now, she did not feel the absence as a loss. She would go up tonight and light it again. And tomorrow night. That was how it worked. Not one grand lighting, not a lamp that burned forever without tending. Just the decision, made again every evening. Just the climb. Just the match. Just the small steady light that the fishermen below might see or might not see, but which would be there regardless. Eleanor had understood that. 45 years of understanding it. Silas touched the brim of his hat as he turned toward the village. Good day's work, he said. Yes, she said, it was. She started up the track. The climb was the same as always. Steep, the gorse bare, the granite ledge cold and gray underfoot, her breath in plumes. Her bag lighter than her trunk had been in October, but the angle of the path the same, the wind off the headland the same, the sound of the sea, below the same enormous patient sound it had always been. She went through the gate. The courtyard was hers, the cleared stone, the rebuilt storage shed, with its fresh timber walls, not yet weathered to the gray of everything else. The kitchen wing solid, smoke-stained at the chimney top, the east window throwing back the last light. She unlocked the kitchen door. Inside it was cold. She'd banked the fire before leaving, but a day and a half was a day and a half. She built it back up. The familiar process, tinder, kindling, the small careful architecture of fire. She had gotten good at this, without noticing she was getting good at it. The room warmed. She put the kettle on. Sat down at the table she had built from salvaged timber, rough, functional level, because she had made Owen check it before she was satisfied, and opened her document case. She took out the copy of the addendum Sims had given her. Set it on the table. February 14th, 1891. Her father had walked into Sims's office on a winter afternoon 3 years ago, and written 1 page. He had not told her. He had not been able to explain it to her, or had decided she didn't need the explanation, or had trusted that she would find her way to needing it, and Sims would know when to produce it. He had done it on faith. Faith in her. She had not known, for most of her life, that she was the kind of person someone had faith in. She put the addendum back in the document case. She reached into her coat pocket and found the key. Mrs. Morse had pressed it into her hand on the last morning at Hartwell Farm. Old iron worn smooth on the bow from years of being held. The key to the garden gate, the gate Richard had changed the locks on the first week he took the house. Useless now. It opened nothing she could reach. She set it on the table beside the lamp. Sat with it for a moment. She thought about Mrs. Morse's hands when she gave it over. Not sentimental. Direct. The way Mrs. Morse gave everything a key, a lesson, a correction, a piece of hard-won knowledge. Without ceremony but with intention. Here, this is yours. Use it for what it's worth. She didn't know exactly what the key was worth now, but she knew she would carry it as long as she was here. She took out the account book, opened it to a clean page, wrote at the top in her small clear handwriting, Spring. Below that, Tower staircase. Tread 7 through 12, replace. North curtain wall, 3 sections, repoint. Kitchen garden, 3rd raised bed. East room window hardware. Main hall ruined, structural assessment. She looked at the list. Long. The real length list of someone doing a real thing, not a dreamed about thing. None of it was impossible. All of it was stone and timber and mortar and time and the willingness to show up every morning and do the next piece. She thought about Eleanor Reed making the same kind of list, probably at this same table or one very close to it, in this same kitchen, or the rougher version of it that had existed in 1850. The same arithmetic of what needed doing and in what order. The same patient calculation of a woman who understood that large things were made of small things done consistently over time. 45 years of small things. She looked at the list a while longer. Added one more item at the bottom, tower lamp. Oil supply, regular schedule. Then she closed the account book, put on her coat, took the oil lamp from the shelf where she kept it, and checked the reservoir. Edmund had filled it. She saw, which meant he had been up here at some point today. She felt a warmth toward him that she didn't have words for. He had just done it. No announcement. No note. Just the filled lamp on the shelf. That was Harwick Cove. That was what 4 months of showing up looked like from the other side. She carried the lamp up the tower stairs. 1st floor. The circular room with the great hearth, cold now, the ash from her last fire white and settled. The shelves Owen had built for her along the curved wall, holding her small collection of books and Eleanor's tin box, and the few objects she had chosen to keep in the room she used most. 2nd floor. The storeroom. Shelves of preserved food, dry goods, the organized provisions of someone who had learned to think in seasons. 3rd floor. Her sleeping room, the cot neatly made. The window facing east toward the open water. Top floor, the lamp room. She stepped up and into it. Small. 6-sided, the windows arranged to throw light in every direction the tower could reach. The iron bracket Eleanor Reed had fixed to the stone of the south-facing window, where the harbor mouth was visible on clear days. The bracket was old now, reddish with surface rust, though the iron beneath was sound. She had tested it. It would hold another 50 years if she kept the rust from getting into the joints. She set her lamp in the bracket, struck a match. The wick caught, small at first as it always was. Then it found its level and steadied, the flame burning clear, and even in the still air of the enclosed room. She stepped back. The light went out through the south window over the harbor, not a lighthouse beam, not an official signal, not visible for miles. Just a lamp. Just a point of warm light above the water on a February evening. in the window of a tower that had been dark for 2 years before she came. She looked out, below the village lights, the harbor mouth, the Atlantic beyond it, going dark in the way the Atlantic went dark not suddenly, but by degrees, the gray deepening and deepening until it was something else entirely. The same water Eleanor had watched for 45 years. The same darkness, the same fishermen's boats making their way home along the coast, reading the lights they knew. She wondered if any of them looked up at the tower window tonight. She wondered if it made any difference to anyone that the light was there. She thought it probably did. Not in any dramatic way. Not the difference between life and death. Just the difference between a known landmark and a dark cliff. Just the small certainty of, that light is there, which means someone is there, which means this place is tended. It was enough. She stayed at the window for a while, long enough to see the last of the light leave the western sky, enough to watch the stars come out over the headland, the winter stars, sharp and cold and indifferent in the best sense. They didn't require anything. They were just there. She went downstairs. The kitchen was warm now. The fire settled into its evening pace, the low steady burn of a good fire in a good hearth in a tight room. She made tea. She sat at the table with the tea and the account book and the key and the addendum in its document case, and she let the warmth come back into her hands. She thought about the courtroom. She thought about Silas Vane at the witness stand, one hand around his hat brim, looking at Fowler with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove and therefore could not be threatened. She thought about the specific things he had said and how he had said them, and the way the room had gone quiet at certain moments. The quiet of people hearing something true. I knew Eleanor Reed for 30 years. I've known Claire Hartwell for 4 months. It's Eleanor I'm speaking for today. She thought about Eleanor writing in her journal on September 14th, 1889. A man came to the gate this morning, William Hartwell, from Portland. She thought about her father, 50 years old, sitting in Eleanor's kitchen, drinking Eleanor's coffee, listening to Eleanor talk about what it had meant to make this place hers. She thought about what he had seen in Eleanor, that he had also seen in Claire, or hoped for in Claire, or known was in Claire, the particular stubbornness of a person who understood that a place was not an inheritance but a relationship. Not something you owned, something you kept faith with. She thought about February 14th, 1891. He had sat down with Sims and written 1 page and walked away and never mentioned it. Had trusted that the page would find its moment. Had trusted Sims to know the moment when it came. Had trusted Claire this was the part she came back to, the part that sat in her chest warm and heavy, and not quite like grief but adjacent to it. Had trusted Claire to be the kind of person who would refuse the $500 and take the pile of rocks. He had been right. She picked up the key, held it in both hands. She thought about Mrs. Morse pressing it into her palm at Hartwell Farm, that last morning. The garden gate key, the gate that was now locked against her with different iron, Richard's iron, closing her out of the place where she'd grown up. She had carried this key for 4 months through every hard day of building and every cold nightiming and every cold on the cliff, and every morning she'd climbed the track with her gloves full of frost and her head full of what needed doing. She had carried it because it was what she had of Mrs. Morse, and because it reminded her of something Mrs. Morse had told her that day in the cellar at Hartwell Farm when she was 11 years old, and the foundation stones were shifting on the north wall, and Mrs. Morse had taken her hand and shown her how to see. A house has bones. Learn its bones, and it will keep you warm when everything else goes cold. She had learned Ravenstone's bones, every crack and every sound wall. Every beam that needed replacing, and every stone that would stand another 100 years. Every angle at which the wind came off the water, and what it meant for the chimney drawer and the garden beds and the mortar joints on the exposed north face. She had learned it the way you learn something you live inside, not by study but by presence, by cold mornings and long evenings, and the continuous conversation between a person and a place when both of them are paying attention. The place had kept her warm. Not just in the physical sense, though that too. The kitchen was warm tonight in a way it had not been when she arrived, and would be warmer still next winter when she had finished the improvements she was planning. But in the other sense, the sense Mrs. Morse had meant. She set the key on the table. She looked at it beside the lamp. Two things. A key that opened nothing and a lamp that held light. One from Mrs. Morse. One from Eleanor Reed. Neither of them people she had known long enough or well enough or in the right circumstances. One had left before she was ready. The other had left before they ever met. But they had both prepared something for her. One a set of skills and one a set of walls, and those two preparations had met here, on this cliff, in this kitchen, and made something she had not expected and could not have planned. A life. Hers. Genuinely, undeniably hers. She heard boots on the courtyard stone outside. She knew the rhythm of those boots. She had been hearing them every morning for 4 months. She got up and opened the kitchen door before he knocked. Silas Vane stood in the courtyard with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and a covered pot in the other hand. Steam came from under the lid. Behind him the courtyard was dark, the February night full around the walls of Ravenstone, the stars overhead. He held out the pot. "My wife made soup," he said. "Thought you might not feel like cooking tonight." She looked at him. She took the pot. He put his hat back on. "Good night, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Good night, Mr. Vane," she said. He walked back across the courtyard and out through the gate. She listened to his boots on the track, going down, growing fainter, until the sound of the Atlantic swallowed them. She closed the kitchen door, set the pot on the hearth. She stood for a moment in the warm room with the fire going, and the lamp on the table and Eleanor's key beside it, and the account book open to tomorrow's list. The Atlantic moved in the dark outside the walls. That low and constant sound, the breathing of something that had been here before all of this, and would be here after, not threatening, not comforting exactly, just present, a fact of the place. Ravenstone's oldest sound. She had grown used to it, the way you grow used to things that are larger than you, not by understanding them, by agreeing to exist alongside them. She looked around the kitchen, the table she had built with her own imperfect carpentry, level because she had made Owen check it. The shelves Mr. Blackwood Owen had fitted to the curved wall, the repaired hearth with its clean drawer, the glazed windows, dark now, holding the reflection of the lamp and the fire, and the room itself back at her. She looked at her own reflection for a moment. She looked like someone who had been doing this for 4 months. The calluses on her hands, the way she held herself, not differently exactly, but more settled. The way a person holds themselves when they know where they are. She knew where she was. She went to the shelf and took down Eleanor's tin box. She didn't open it. She just held it. The smooth metal under her hands, warm from the kitchen air, the weight of all those years inside it. 45 years of daily accounting. Every storm that had come off the Atlantic and every morning after. Every season of the garden and every season of the sea. Every night the lamp went up and every morning it came down. Eleanor had started the journal when she was 30 years old. Claire was 24. She had time. She put the box back on the shelf. She served herself a bowl of Mrs. Vane's soup potato and salt cod, thick and simple, and exactly what she needed. She ate at the table she had built, in the kitchen she had cleared, in the house she had made her responsibility. Outside, above the harbor, the lamp burned in the tower window. Someone in the village might look up and see it. Someone bringing a boat in along the coast might see it and know the headland by it. More likely no one would notice. More likely it was just a light in a window, unremarkable, the same as the lights in the cottage windows below. But it was there. That was the point Eleanor had understood, and Claire was coming to understand, and the only way to fully understand was to keep doing it. She finished her soup, washed the bowl, opened the account book to the spring list. She added one more line. Garden gate, new lock, her own key. She looked at it. Then she closed the book. Tomorrow Owen would come, and Silas, and Edmund, probably, without being asked, because that was Edmund. There would be stone to move, and mortar to mix, and the 7th tread on the tower staircase to replace before someone's foot went through it. There would be the morning light coming grey and cold off the Atlantic, and the smell of salt in everything, and the sound of the harbor below, and all the ordinary daily business of being here. She was ready for it. She had been ready for it since October, she thought. Since before that, maybe. since an afternoon in a cellar when she was 11 years old, and a woman with capable hands had taken her by the wrist and shown her how to see the bones of a house and trust that bones were enough. She blew out the table lamp. The kitchen went dark except for the fire. She sat in the firelight for a while, the way Eleanor had probably sat, the way anyone who lives alone in a place with a good fire eventually learns to sit, not restless, not bored, but simply present in the warmth. Then she went upstairs to sleep. Above her, in the tower window, the lamp burned steadily. It would burn through the night, and in the morning she would climb up and tend it, and then she would come back down and start the list.